Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here today, here at St. Anselm's in New Hampshire. 4 hours ago, I was in Washington, D.C., dealing with BP oil spill claims. But when I got the invitation to come to St. Anselm's, I felt I was in very elite company. I'm sure you guys know this, but St. Anselm's and its speaker series is known far and wide. And it's sort of a rite of passage for me to get an invitation to actually come up here and speak is particularly rewarding to me, and I'm glad I could do it. Now, in about 30 minutes, I want to explain to everybody the pros and cons of these special compensation programs. You mentioned Agent Orange veterans, Vietnam veterans. There was a compensation program for them. Then there was a compensation program that I administered that Congress passed a law setting up the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund just 11 days after the attacks. Then I got a call from the governor of Virginia and the president of Virginia Tech after the deranged gunman shot and killed 32 students and faculty in Blacksburg, Virginia. A special fund was created then. And the PAYOUts, a different type of fund, but there Congress passed a law saying that compensation of key executives in the 7 companies that received the most taxpayer assistance in order to survive, there should be regulation of their compensation. And now BP, in some ways, the biggest challenge of all. In 9 months, with the BP oil spill, 9 months, I have received 850,000 claims from 50 states. Now, you might ask, why is somebody filing a claim from New Hampshire? Let me tell you, when a company like BP announces to the world that there's $20 billion to be had, and also says to the world, we will make you whole, let's say you get some rather creative claims coming in the door. And so that's been a challenge to decide what claims are eligible and not eligible and how much people should receive. But these examples beg the bigger question. And as a matter of public policy, where better than at this school and this institute to discuss some of the mega questions that arise when you create these programs. Let's begin, or let's summarize some of the key issues that come up all the time in any debate about the wisdom of these programs. First, are these programs the wave of the future? Are these programs a good idea? They ought to be designed and administered whenever there is some sort of national catastrophe. The answer to that question is that these programs are aberrations. They are not the wave of the future. They are few and far between, and they should remain few and far between. The traditional, conventional way that we resolve disputes in this country is in the courtroom. You choose your lawyer, they'll choose their lawyer, the judge will be the umpire, and the case will be resolved in court. The idea that we'll create BP-type, 9/11-type funds as an administrative, legislative alternative to the traditional way that we dispense compensation in this country is A, not a good idea, and B, even if you think it is a good idea because you don't like lawyers and you don't like the legal system, it ain't gonna happen. The legal system in this country, judges, juries, lawyers, is so ingrained in the fabric of our society. It is so much a part of our history that the idea that there will ever be a wholesale replacement of the traditional, conventional way of resolving disputes is wishful thinking. It isn't going to happen. In 1840, when Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, was journeying around the country, he wrote that great book, that pamphlet, 1840, Democracy in America. In that book, de Tocqueville comments on how sooner or later it seems that every major issue in American life ends up in the courtroom. And I think that's true. So I think the first summary point is to note that these programs that I administer, that are reflected in the introduction a few minutes ago, are aberrations. They are not a precedent for anything. They rarely come up. I mean, you mentioned the ones I've been involved in. That's a half a dozen over 35 years. They're not commonplace. They are a reaction to some national news and are relatively rare and should stay that way. And even if they shouldn't stay there, they will stay that way. Now the second point. Are these programs, even if they're going to be rare, are they, and even if they're aberrations, are they a good idea? Are they sound public policy? Well, as somebody who designs and administers these programs, I think they are a good idea, rare as they may be. And I think that on those rare occasions where policymakers decide to create these programs like BP or 9/11, they're a response to a need. They work. And looking back, I defend them. But I must say, it is a very, very close question. When I was administering the 9/11 fund, paying about $2 million a claim, tax-free, to every family that lost a loved one in 9/11, World Trade Center, the airplanes, or the Pentagon, you should have read some of the emails that I received. Dear Mr. Feinberg, I don't get it. I lost my son in Oklahoma City. Where's my check? Dear Mr. Feinberg, I lost my son defending America on the USS Cole in Yemen, killed by suicide bombers. Where's my check? Dear Mr. Feinberg, I don't get it. I lost my wife in the basement of the World Trade Center in the original 1993 attacks committed by the very same people. Why aren't I eligible for a check? And it didn't end with terrorism, you see. Dear Mr. Feinberg, explain something to me. I'm following your progress with this 9/11 fund. Last year, my wife saved 3 little girls from drowning in the Mississippi River, and then she drowned of heroin. Where's my check? How do you justify, you see, setting up these programs for very generous compensation for a small segment of American society, victims, when there are victims every day? Bad things happen to good people every day in this country. Tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes. There's not a 9/11 fund or a BP oil fund. How do you justify, you see, carving out for very special, lucrative treatment a small group of people who are the victims of life's misfortune? You know, we don't do it very often. People take risks in the world and in our society. You make decisions where you want to live, what you want to do for a living. There's not waiting in the background a special insurance fund for just some people. The American people and our heritage, we frown on elitism and special treatment for a very small segment. And when I was doing the 9/11 fund and reading this correspondence that came to me, it was very, very difficult for me to explain. Notice, there was no 9/11 fund for the Katrina victims, 1,000 dead. There was no special compensation last week for the victims of the tornadoes in the southeastern part of the United States. I mean, why these folks and not everybody else? Now, having said that, I will defend vigorously the wisdom of the 9/11 fund. It was the right thing to do, but it wasn't the right thing to do from the perspective of the victims. I have a very difficult time trying to figure out why some victims get $2 million and everybody else doesn't, from the perspective of the American people who wanted to show their sense of community, their resilience, their support, their empathy for the victims. From the perspective of America acting through its elected representatives, I think the program was absolutely justifiable. Just don't do it again. Because there's a third issue. There's a third issue in any summary of these programs, and that is this. Notice that in virtually all of these programs, authority to design and administer these programs is delegated to one person. That's very, very risky business, I want to tell you. You know, during the Wall Street crisis, the press, the Secretary of the Treasury delegated to me fixing pay for corporate officials. And the press latched onto this and said Feinberg is the pay czar. Now, that's a very unfortunate term to describe me as the pay czar. First of all, my grandmother in Lithuania would be very confused by the title. I assure you she'd be confused. But aside from that, it made it sound as if one person is issuing imperial, arbitrary edicts about pay. When the fact of the matter is that that program, I really worked with the companies to try and work out a mutual, satisfactory compensation program. It'll never be repeated. That law, passed by Congress, setting this up, was a populist reaction to the TOP program. I doubt it'll ever be repeated. The idea that the government is fixing the pay of private individuals in the private capitalist corporate marketplace, not only promulgating prescriptions about pay, actually determining the dollars. Very, very rare. Unprecedented. Won't happen again. Most of these programs are one-offs. They're a reaction at the time. You do them, you move on. But this is my third point. You know, you delegate to one person all of this authority. In 9/11, the Congress passed a law and said, Attorney General Ashcroft, you appoint one person, no appeals. We're not going to appropriate any money for this because we don't know what it costs. What is a life worth? Whatever it is, Feinberg will decide and take the money out of petty cash from the U.S. Treasury. So there's no checks and balances. It's sort of a, now, it may work, but as a political science matter, ask yourself the question whether delegating this authority to implement a program like this is a good idea, is sound public policy. So I think that relatively rare, these programs, they are not a replacement. They are not the wave of the future. They raise profound philosophic questions about singling out some people. Here's a check, while everybody else, fend for yourself. And it raises important questions about delegation of authority to a person who has this power. So I do these things once every 6 years or whenever, I worry every day. I read the newspaper, something terrible happened. But they're relatively rare and they ought to stay that way. Now, I'm always asked the question, how much of what you do is substantive, legal, rules, prescriptions, principles, terms, conditions, and how much of it requires some other personality traits, some other reinforcement that allows you to deal with these problems? And there is some substance involved in this, of course. Obviously, you have to set up the rules and the regulations. What makes these jobs particularly challenging is the emotion, not the substantive rules, but the emotion associated with the tragedy, giving rise to compensation for loss. Now think about that. In every one of these programs, what really poses the most significant obstacle to success is the often irrational but understandable reaction of the victims. People say to me, is your law degree an advantage in doing these programs? I say a law degree is, I think, on balance, a wash. Doesn't help, it doesn't hurt. A divinity degree, that would help in a lot of these cases. A divinity degree. Because what you really have to do, you see, is empathize and understand that the victim, human nature being what it is, feels absolutely wronged and realizes that compensation is in some sense a poor substitute for grief. 9/11 is the best example, of course, because Congress, in its infinite wisdom, passed that law 11 days after 9/11. So we were offering compensation to survivors before bodies had been recovered, before the dust had settled at the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. And when you deal with victims in times of tragedy, be prepared, human nature, what it is, to receive the brunt of a view, of an opinion, of an attitude that I am the victim of life's misfortune. Why me? Why me, Mr. Feinberg? Mrs. Jones, I'm here to tell you that you'll receive $3 million tax-free for the death of your husband. Give me back my husband. You can keep the $3 million. Well, I don't have the authority or the power to do that, but yeah. When you're here to give, it's a pretty, thank you. You know, $3 million is a pretty poor substitute for the loss of my husband. How you relate to people, how you get them to focus on what you can do and can't do with these programs. That's the challenge, really. 2 examples. 9/11. A 24-year-old woman comes to see me. Mr. Feinberg, I'm here. I have 2 children, 6 and 4. I lost my husband. He was a fireman at the World Trade Center. Now, I see that you're going to give me $1.3 million. I want that money in 30 days. 30 days. I said to this lady, Mrs. Jones, we have to go through a procedure with Treasury, etc. Why do you need the money in 30 days? Why? I'll tell you why, Mr. Feinberg. I have terminal cancer. I have 10 weeks to live. My husband, a fireman, was going to survive me and raise our 2 children. Now they're going to be orphans. So I need that money right away to set up a trust fund, and I want it now. Well, we accelerated the payments. 10 weeks later, we went to her funeral. You can't plan these things. That's that. And they're not all, everyone is different. People say all the time during the 9/11 fund, you know, you're up at 3 a.m. pacing the halls with some of these. A lady comes to see me, sobbing after 9/11. Just sobbing. I thought she would collapse. Mr. Feinberg, I lost my husband. He was a fireman at the World Trade Center. And he left me with our 3 children, 6, 4, and 2. Every day that he wasn't at the firehouse, he was home teaching the 6-year-old how to play baseball, teaching the 4-year-old how to read, reading a bedtime story to the 2-year-old. And what a chef. He cooked all our meals. He was the gardener around the house. He was Mr. Mom. I'll never be the same without him. The only reason I haven't jumped out a window and joined him in heaven is because we have the 3 children. And I got to take care of them and raise them to remember their father, Mr. Mom. But I'm done, Mr. Feinberg. My life is over. He was my rock, my best friend. He's gone. Nothing you can give me will replace that. She leaves. The next day, I get a telephone call from a lawyer in Queens. Mr. Feinberg, did you meet yesterday with the wife, Mr. Mom, and the 3 kids, 6, 4, and 2? Uh-huh. Now look, I'm not trying to cause any trouble, Mr. Feinberg. Really, I'm not. But I want you to know, she doesn't know that her husband, Mr. Mom, has 2 other kids by his girlfriend in Queens, 5 and 3. And I'm calling to tell you that when you cut your check, there's not 3 surviving children, there's 5 surviving children, see? And I represent the girlfriend on behalf of the 2 children. I'm sure you'll do the right thing. Click, hangs up the phone. Now, do you tell her? Do you tell her, Mrs. Jones, before you get all carried away here about Mr. Mom, there's 2 other children over here in Queens? Or, no, she has a memory of her husband, who am I? That's what keeps you up on these programs you see at 3 a.m. That's what you walk the halls about, not the rules and regulations. How do you apply the rules in particular cases? I decided not to tell her. Now, it's 10 years later, I'll bet you anything she knows. But who am I to interfere or intervene in this lady's memory of her husband? I don't know the facts. I don't know. I'm a bureaucrat trying to dispense money. And I'm getting all of these curveballs thrown at me. So what we did in that case, we cut 2 checks. We cut 1 check to the surviving wife and the 3 children, and then we cut a separate check, unbeknownst to her, to the girlfriend as guardian of the 2 children. That was it. Move on, next case. But that's the problem, you see. You have to deal in these special circumstances with human nature. All the lawyering in the world doesn't help you when it comes time to deal with how human beings react to tragedy. I see it now every day in the Gulf of Mexico. Mr. Feinberg, because of that BP oil spill, I couldn't take my boat out and fish. I was going to go out in that but for that spill last April 20th, I was going out fishing. I would have caught $100,000 worth of fish. Pay me. Well, Captain Jones, the problem is that on the date of the spill, your boat was in dry dock with 2 tax liens on it, an involuntary petition for bankruptcy filed before the spill. So the idea that your boat would have been out on the water fishing I mean, doesn't appear to be based on... Doesn't matter. I had nothing to do with that spill. Believe me, but for that spill, I could have told the bank, let the Lins go, I'll go out, I'll fish, I'll get the money, we'll get out of bankruptcy, It wasn't my fault, the spill. Pay me, pay me. Human nature. It's not my fault. The future was bright. Mr. Feinberg, I couldn't fish and I lost $100,000 in income because I couldn't fish. Pay me. Well, Captain Jones, I'm glad, I got the money, but your tax return says $40,000, not $100,000. Oh, come on. Come on. We do things with a handshake down here. You're from up north, a Yankee. You don't know how we operate down here. Pay me. A senator writes me a letter and says, I think it's an outrage that you haven't paid 7 of my constituents, Joe Jones, Bill Smith, Mary Brooks, list 7. Senator, don't send me, if you want to criticize me in a letter, that's fine. But when you cite the name of the claimant, I'm going to go look up answers now. Joe Jones, fraud. It's going to go to Leavenworth. You mentioned Bill Smith. We didn't pay him. Oh, we only paid him. You said in your letter, Senator, you only paid Bill Smith 7% of what he asked for. Yeah. He asked for an amount 250 times his total gross income last year. Not going to pay it. Human nature. It's not fraud, most of these claims in the Gulf. We're paid $4 billion in 9 months. We didn't pay the restaurant in New Hampshire that wanted to get paid. The restaurant in New Hampshire wrote us, Mr. Feinberg, we served the best shrimp scampi in New Hampshire. Now we can't get Gulf shrimp. We've lost 10% of our clientele. Pay us. A little bit closer to the Gulf would help in your claim. But we got claims from 50 states. We've never had a program like BP where you've got, 850,000 claims. Why so many claims? Because BP announces to the world, 20 billion, come one, come all, we'll make you whole. Well, let me tell you, you announce 20 billion, you build it, and they will come. They will come, and they will come, I understand, human nature. Why not? We've received claims, dentists, chiropractors, veterinarians. Now, some of them have very legitimate claims, I must tell you. I can come up with a law school hypothetical for a dentist to have a valid claim. Mr. Feinberg, I have a dental office right on the beach in Pensacola. 50% of my patients are tourists who come down during the winter and break a tooth, get a cavity, right on the beach. Here's the appointment book. New Hampshire, Boston, New York, Maine, Philadelphia. Pay me. Valid claim. Valid claim. It's the dentist who's, 50 miles inland who says the whole economy's been hurt by the spill, including all these fishermen that are my patients. Fishermen 50 miles to go to a dentist. You have to step back. So there are problems in all of these cases, you see. They're not easy. Virginia Tech, $8 million in unsolicited private contributions came into Virginia Tech. Mr. Feinberg, I'm the president of Virginia Tech. Will you come down here and help us design a program to distribute the $8 million to the families of the 32 dead and all of these college students that either were physically injured jumping out a window to escape, wounded by bullets, or a lot of students are traumatized mentally by watching all of this from their dormitory windows. First thing you do when you do Virginia Tech, you talk about the serendipitous nature of life and death. Who would have thought when you send your kids to school in Blacksburg, Virginia, in the middle of nowhere, dead, killed by a deranged gunman? All of the problems you see you have to confront. Families of the 32 dead, I think we're designing the program. Every family gets the same, $212,000. Unlike the 9/11 fund, where I was required by law to give everybody a different amount of money. Virginia Tech, 32 dead, all life is equal, everybody gets $212,000. Agreed? Wait a minute. Mr. Feinberg, I don't understand something. Why is everybody getting the same amount of money? 30 or 29 of the dead were students on scholarship. My wife, my husband was a faculty member, a wage earner. He ought to get more than I ought to get more than the family who has a student. Economic loss. Judges and juries every day in New Hampshire talk about economic loss. Faculty member worth more than the student. Nope. Controversy number one, everybody gets the same. 2, physical injury. Physical injury. Mr. Feinberg, my son was shot in the head and survived. He's okay, thank God. I should get more money than the student who jumps out a window to escape and breaks an ankle. A brain injury is more serious than an ankle injury. Give me more compensation. Well, I think that's right, but I mean, how are we going to decide what constitutes a methodology for deciding how much to give? I mean, don't start sending me medical records. I'm not a doctor. There's got to be a surrogate. There's got to be a way to determine a ranking of physical injury leading to compensation. How about we came up with one? The longer you're in the hospital, the more serious the injury. We'll pay more based on hospital records as to how long you were in. Now, you'd think that would be non-controversial. You got to be kidding. Mr. Feinberg, I don't understand. Why is that? That's not a fair test. My son had a serious bullet wound. Brave that he was, he came home and didn't want to stay in the hospital. His courage ought to be rewarded. I'm not going to start determining existential courage. I mean, hospitalization becomes the test, but it's not a foolproof test, believe me. Mr. Feinberg, I want my daughter paid. She wasn't physically injured at all. She can barely get out of bed now. She saw the whole thing unfold from her dormitory window. She's suffering post-traumatic stress. Pay us. No, we're not going to pay. We haven't got enough money. We'll give free mental counseling through the university. Oh, wait a minute. There may be a case where we should pay post-traumatic stress. We'll define it. If you were a student actually in the room where the massacre took place, and but for fortune, you escaped. There, but for fortune, you got away. And now you suffering mental damage, we'll pay that. One lady came to see me. She said, Ms. Feinberg, my daughter, she was in the classroom. The gunman came in. He killed the person to her left. He killed the person to his right, pointed the gun at her. He was out of bullets. Click, click. While he was reloading, she jumped out a window and escaped. We'll pay that claim. But across the street, arbitrary. These programs are all, to a certain extent, the criteria have to be arbitrary. So you see, this is how these programs work. Unconventional responses to unique tragedies, how the law confronts these situations. And you can see in just a half an hour, you gotta be a little bit like Solomon. I mean, you've gotta come up with a program, rules that define these things. And the more you try and come up with neutral principles of compensation, the more the irony that, well, I'll do it, I'm asked to do it. I'll take the heat for doing it. But one thing that comes out of this that's sort of ironic is when you're asked all the time, Mr. Feinberg, you've sort of made a career out of this. You must think that these programs really are a good idea. And my answer is, they're a good idea. Just don't replicate them. Be very, very careful. My last point is my first point. Be very, very careful about deciding that as a matter of public policy, we ought to do these programs much more often. The only time you do these programs is when policymakers acting on behalf of the public decide that based on these unique circumstances, it's a good idea to do these programs. Fortunately, I'm not called on that often. I'm fairly certain the Japanese will not come to me. I'm fairly certain, and this is my final point, I'll tell you why, just so you'll know a tidbit of information when you leave. Neither Japan nor to a certain extent the United States needs one of these programs if there's a nuclear disaster. Because there are already laws on the books, you see, the Price-Anderson Act here in the United States. In Japan, like the United States, the nuclear utility industry pays into a special fund every month, premiums, to pay for insurance in case of a catastrophe. I think in Japan there is about $4 billion currently in this fund to pay the victims of the earthquake and the tsunami. Now, $4 billion won't do it, but under Japanese law and US law, if the private insurance program is exhausted, the government picks up the difference. So that's maybe sort of a response in the event if the Japanese decide to compensate. So that's sort of the overview. I've taken about 40 minutes, and I think we ought to leave some time now. The powers that be here at St. Anselm's told me that it's a very sophisticated audience with very good questions, particularly from students, and I thought we'd save about 20 minutes for questions. Let's go. I came a long way, folks. We should have some questions. Yes, sir.
After the Exxon Valdez oil spill, a law was passed limiting the exposure of the oil company in a situation like this, measured in millions. And yet, we evolved to where there's a $20 billion fund. What are your thoughts on how the existing law just disappeared in the zeal, I guess, of the Congress to do more?
The existing law hasn't disappeared. Existing law is still in force. If you go to court in the BP oil spill, you'll have to navigate the question of whether and to what extent existing law and caps on liability apply. What BP did with at the urging of the president, notwithstanding existing law, which is over here, the conventional litigation system. If you want to enter voluntarily this other program and take the money where there is no cap, that's your prerogative. You can always go through Feinberg's process, claims process. If you don't like what you're going to get, you can say, no, I'd rather take my chances in court and litigate. And there are people who have done that. So existing law continues to lie ready for those claimants who want to become plaintiffs in suing, and will have that option if they so decide. It's purely voluntary. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Feinberg, it seems to me, I listen to a lot of news, and there's always an attack on you in every program that I listen to. I think I've heard more than 25 victims of the of the oil spill. Well, I don't listen. I mean, there's got to be limits on television. The last lady I heard was from the Louisiana Institute, and they're all really, really upset with you because they say that the procedure for claiming compensation is too complex, and lots and lots of poor and subsistence fisher people haven't been paid. What's your reaction to that?
First of all, if you can't stand the heat, don't do these programs. I mean, when you take on these assignments, you know, when the president or the attorney general or BP or anybody asks you, are you willing to do this? And you say yes. Well, nobody put a gun to your head and told you had to do it. So you better be prepared when you're talking about compensating people, providing money to people. You better be prepared to take that type of heat. Now, I must say, I acknowledge, as I did with 9/11 the first year as well, some of this criticism that I confront now is in good faith, and I think, frankly, is accurate. When people say, Mr. Feinberg, it's an outrage. My next-door neighbor got $20,000, and you only gave me $5,000, and we have the same job, we work in the same place, you gave him 4 times what you gave me. That's an outrage. Goes on TV and makes a big complaint about it. Now, you go back and you look at those claims. In fairness to the fishermen, when you've got 850,000 claims and you've got 3,500 people evaluating the claims, there may be some inconsistency. If there is an inconsistency that's not justified, if we made a mistake, we'll correct it. We'll pay you the other $15,000. Now, let's not get too carried away with this criticism. You got $5,000 and your next door neighbor got $20,000 because he reported on his income tax return $20,000 and you reported $5,000. What do you want from me? I'm not paying you 4 times what you reported. A. B. Don't always believe what your next door neighbor's telling you. Money does things to people sometimes. Just because your next door neighbor says, you only got 5, I got 20. Maybe he did. Maybe she didn't. In these programs, you always hope, usually vainly, you always hope, don't count other people's money. Don't count other people's money. How are you treated? Doesn't work that way. It's contrary to human nature, you see. We saw it in 9/11. Mr. Feinberg, I'm a fireman's widow. A fireman. You gave me $2 million. You gave the banker's widower, she worked for Enron, $4 million. Why are you denigrating the memory of my husband who died a hero as a fireman? Mrs. Jones, I'm not denigrating anybody. The law says I have to be judge and jury. I have to look at what the dead were earning at the time of death. That's what judges and juries in New Hampshire do every day in Manchester. Every day. If a banker gets hit by a car in Manchester, the survivors are getting more than the busboy or the waiter that gets hit by a car. That's the system. Well, you try telling that to the fireman's widow. Huh. Don't tell me. It's a slap in the face. So you take the criticism, A. If you've made a mistake, admit it. We've made plenty of mistakes. We admit it. But when you haven't made a mistake and you're criticized unfairly, one congressman wrote and said, the way your program's working with BP, it's like mafia-like extortion. What? I wrote him back. So there we are. Couple more questions. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the methodology for the TARP executive compensation? Was there a methodology besides public perception or
whim?
Or whim?
No, there was a real methodology. Here's the question. Here's the question. How much do you pay corporate executives at the 7 companies that got the most taxpayer assistance? AIG, GM, GMAC, Chrysler, Chrysler Financial, Citigroup, Bank of America. Now, the law passed by Congress says, Feinberg, delegated by the Secretary of Treasury, you decide what they're going to make. Now, I would have thought taking on that job, it would raise howls of protest. The government interfering with the private marketplace, not a whimper. People didn't care. Government officials didn't care. Basically, the argument was, look, the taxpayer saved those 7 companies. We own them. We have every right to fix their pay. Feinberg as a surrogate for the creditors, the people of the United States. It was all taxpayer money. I would have thought there'd be a howl, a philosophic protest, government intervention in private Wall Street. Go ahead, do it. Don't expand your authority, but as to those 7 companies that only survived because of the taxpayer, go right ahead and fix their pay. Then I thought, having dodged that bullet, that no one would care. 7 companies. Who's going to really focus on this? Well, was I wrong about that? Everybody wanted to know, what's he really going to give them? What's he really going to give? The actual dollars. What's he going to pay those guys? Main Street was very interested in that, especially in times of financial uncertainty, you see. What's he going to pay the CFO? So we set up a methodology. Now, how did we do it? Well, first we read the statute. Pay shall be based on competence. Well, thank you very much, Congress. That's a very helpful prescription. Pay shall promote company competitiveness. Okay, right. That's good too. Pay shall promote company loyalty. Very helpful. Okay, we want you to stay in the job. So we first looked at what Congress said in the statute. Then I asked the companies, give me the data. What do you think they ought to pay these people? Well, the companies rolled in wheelbarrows full of data. A CFO at Citigroup is worth $7 million. Well, wait a minute. All right, that's okay. You give us all that data. Then we go and get our own data independently. We went out and got our own data to compare. Citigroup, you say a CFO is worth $7 million. We went and, looked at the data. He's only worth $4 million. Oh, you don't understand. Our CFO is different from other CFO. He drives the limo. He cooks in the kitchen. He works in the library, does other things. So you're apples and oranges. It's not the same CFO job. All right? Methodology. Then we went out and sought to hire independent compensation consultants. There are no independent compensation. We couldn't find any. In the commercial area, they're all one way or another working for the companies. So we went and got academics. We got academics from Harvard, from Southern Cal, and we used academic help. Give us some ideas as to how we ought to develop that methodology. And then from all of that, and then we invited the companies in for interviews. All right, AIG. What do you think we ought to pay the CFO and why? Well, you ought to pay him $7 million. If you don't pay our CFO, they all said this. All of the companies said this. If you don't pay our CFO what we're asking, she's going to leave. And the taxpayers' investment in AIG is going to be at risk if she leaves. She's indispensable. She's indispensable. I say to people, the graveyards are filled with indispensable people, right? She's indispensable. And you know where she's going to go if she leaves? Oh, they all said this. Do you know where she's going to go if she leaves? She's not going to go across the street to another competitor. She's going to go to China. Everybody's going to China to work. No, everybody. That's the threat. Going to go to China. Going to go to Europe. We're going to lose this talent. And we went back and forth and developed a methodology that basically said compensation should be based on relatively modest cash guaranteed annual income. A small base salary. Small, I mean, these companies, $400,000, $500,000 base salary, cash. The rest of your compensation should be in the form of stock, but it ought to be stock that cannot be redeemed over a period, except over a period of years. So you have to stay there and make the company thrive. If the company thrives, you thrive. The stock's tied to your performance and the company's performance. I mean, it's not rocket science what we came up with, but we think that the prescriptions were made sense. So that's sort of, there's a whole executive report I issued in 2009 and 10 documenting what we went through and the methodology we used to compensate. And, but it was for a small group of companies and a small group of corporate officials. The whole program was largely a sideshow. It was a populist reaction to Wall Street. One more question. Last one? Anybody? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Mr. Feinberg.
You have a question also? Two more questions. Okay.
Based on the fact that these are aberrations, going forward, what do you think are the key questions that need to be asked before the next TARP program or the next fund is set up in the future?
The key question is whether or not, from the perspective not of the victims, or not from the view of the malfeasance on Wall Street, but from the perspective of the American people, do we want to do this program because by doing the program, these aberrations, society as a whole benefits? Not the victim. The victim is the target of our largesse or our regulation. The real question is, from the perspective of the American people acting through their elected representatives and their regulators, is this something that inures to the benefit of society as a whole? Easy with TARP, of course it does. Populist revulsion at Wall Street, which is nothing new in our history, of course. That's the first question. I don't think those questions can be answered prospectively. They can only be answered after the tragedy occurs. And now, does it rise to the level of 9/11, let's do something? Or is it a terrible tragedy, but like Katrina, let's not do something? That's a question you can only answer after the fact. Last question.
When dealing with reparation programs, do you look to other countries, what they've done, specifically truth commissions? And with that, could you see a truth commission in the United States itself, or is it too specific to have one?
I don't think that looking at what foreign governments have done is of much help to us here. First of all, no country on earth has a litigation system like we have, where these programs are set up as an alternative to the litigation system. Be careful about truth commissions. Truth commissions usually take place when governments offer reparations. We made a mistake. Let's get at the truth. Apartheid in South Africa. No one in these programs in the United States has ever acknowledged blame. Never. Say what you want about the 9/11 fund. One thing it wasn't was reparations. The American government to this day has never said we apologize to the American people for the attacks on 9/11. This was a foreign attack. We're not apologizing. BP isn't apologizing. BP is setting up a program, but they're not saying we're a wrongdoer. But we're not apologizing. We think Halliburton and Transocean ought to be paying as well. Now, there are instances in American history where the government does apologize. You'll remember President Reagan in 1980. Congress passed a law, and the president said, when it comes to the next generation, when it comes to the Japanese American citizens who were relocated from the West Coast after Pearl Harbor, we apologize on behalf of the American people. We made a mistake. Here's a modest check for the survivors, $20,000. We made a mistake. Pretty rare for governments to admit mistakes. And, you know, the German government, we apologize for the Holocaust. Here's $5 billion to distribute to Holocaust survivors. We are sorry. That's far different from programs that are established quite apart from acquiescence of guilt or admission of guilt or fault in order to compensate for other reasons. 9/11, we're compensating people so they'll voluntarily won't sue the airlines. That's one reason we're doing it. So, BP, we're compensating people so they won't bring a lawsuit. We'll give them money now. So you have to make that distinction. Let me just say, I'm thrilled that I received this invitation to visit St. Anselm's. Your institute and your speakers program is known far and wide, I'll tell you that. And when it's sort of a rite of passage, when I finally got the invitation, I said, gee, I must be doing something right, or at least I'm controversial, at least. So I want to thank everybody in New Hampshire, and I want to thank St. Anselm's. I want to thank all of you, and I'm honored by the invitation, so thank you very much.